There's something beautifully powerful about silence, especially when it comes from a person who used to explain, justify, and fight for understanding. You see, when a super empath finally stops talking, it's not because they have nothing to say. It's because they've finally realized that their words were falling into an emotional void, a place where their warmth was never truly received. The avoidant thrives on emotional distance. It's their comfort zone, their armor against intimacy. But what they don't realize is that silence, real, grounded, peaceful silence, is the empath's ultimate act of quiet rebellion. A super empath's revenge doesn't come in the form of arguments, bitterness, or loud confrontation. It comes through transformation. When the empath stops chasing, stops explaining, and starts healing, everything changes. That silence becomes a mirror one that reflects the avoidance emptiness right back at them. Suddenly, the avoidance control begins to slip because the energy they once fed on is gone. The empath who once overflowed with love, validation, and understanding now redirects all that energy inward toward peace, purpose, and self-respect. The most silent form of revenge isn't about making someone feel what they made you feel. It's about showing them that they no longer can. When an empath heals, they break the cycle. They start choosing presence over approval, peace over chaos, and boundaries over longing. That shift is powerful, not because it punishes the avoidant, but because it reclaims everything the empath once gave away. And make no mistake, the avoidant feels it. They may never say it, but deep down, they sense that something has changed, that the person who once made them feel safe in their distance has finally walked away from the dance. The true revenge of the super empath is freedom. Freedom from overthinking, from emotional dependence, from trying to fix what was never theirs to fix. The empath doesn't need to prove a point. Their silence does it for them. They no longer fight for attention because their focus has shifted to building a life so full, so meaningful, that the avoidant's coldness becomes irrelevant. The avoidant may retreat into detachment, but the empath rises into strength. And that rise, quiet, graceful, and unstoppable, is the sweetest revenge of all. Silence is often misunderstood as a sign of defeat or retreat, but when a super empath embraces it after enduring the emotional coldness of an avoidant, it becomes their most powerful weapon. For the empath, silence doesn't come easily. They are natural communicators, healers, and emotional connectors. They want to talk things through, to understand, to bridge gaps with compassion. So when they finally stop talking, it's not because they've run out of things to say, it's because they've realized that their words have lost their meaning in the presence of someone who refuses to listen. This silence is not about absence. It's about presence, a new kind of presence that centers around peace, boundaries, and self-preservation. For so long, the super empath has been the emotional lifeline in the relationship, constantly extending patience and understanding towards someone who recoils from vulnerability. The avoidant often mistakes the empath's warmth for neediness, seeing their efforts to connect as pressure. Yet, the empath's intention is never to suffocate, it's to love deeply. But once that love is consistently met with indifference or withdrawal, something inside the empath shifts. They realize that speaking louder, explaining harder, or loving more intensely won't reach someone who's emotionally barricaded. Silence then becomes a conscious decision, a reclaiming of energy that was once scattered across endless attempts to be seen and heard. When the empath falls silent, the dynamic reverses. The avoidant, who once thrived in emotional control and distance, suddenly finds themselves unsettled. The quiet becomes deafening. The absence of communication, the very thing the avoidant once craved, now exposes the emptiness they tried to avoid. The empath's silence acts like a mirror reflecting the emotional void the avoidant carries within. It confronts them with the realization that the connection they took for granted was in fact being held together by the empath's emotional labor. Without that energy, the relationship loses its balance and the avoidant is left faced with the hollowness of their own detachment. For the empath, this silence is an awakening. It's the moment they stop trying to be understood by someone incapable of meeting them on an emotional level. Instead, they turn inward. They begin to understand that not every connection deserves constant nurturing, especially when it comes at the cost of their own peace. Silence becomes their sanctuary, a space where they can hear their own thoughts, rediscover their strength, and remind themselves that their value was never dependent on someone else's ability to recognize it. In that silence, power builds quietly but steadily. The empath learns that they don't need to prove their worth, explain their emotions, or chase closure. Their absence speaks louder than any words ever could. The avoidant may interpret the silence as indifference at first, but soon enough, it becomes a haunting reminder of what they lost not through drama, but through stillness. Silence becomes the empath's final language, one that communicates self-respect, strength, and detachment far more eloquently than words ever could. It's not about punishing the avoidant. It's about reclaiming the energy that was once wasted on trying to melt their coldness. In silence, the empath finally takes back their power. Transformation is the moment the super empath stops trying to change the avoidant and instead begins changing themselves. It's the shift from chasing understanding to creating peace, from seeking validation to building self-worth. The empath has spent so much time pouring love, patience, and energy into someone emotionally closed off that they forget what it feels like to receive. When they reach their breaking point, they don't lash out or seek revenge. Through anger, they withdraw, reflect, and rebuild. That quiet metamorphosis is the true form of power, one that doesn't need to scream to be felt. Transformation becomes their unspoken declaration that the game of emotional imbalance is over. At first, the avoidant may not notice the change. They've grown used to the empath being the constant, the one who texts first, who explains misunderstandings, who holds space for both people in the relationship. But transformation is not loud. It's subtle and steady, like the turning of a tide. The empath begins to say less, do less, and expect less, not out of bitterness, but because they finally understand their value doesn't depend on someone's willingness to appreciate it. They stop trying to fix what's broken in the avoidant and start fixing what's been neglected within themselves. Every act of self-care, every boundary enforced, every moment spent in peace instead of pursuit, it all builds a new version of the empath, one that no longer needs the avoidant's emotional permission to feel worthy. This transformation becomes the avoidant's silent undoing. The dynamic that once gave them control starts to collapse when the empath no longer reacts to their withdrawal or chases after their attention. The avoidant loses the power they didn't even realize they held. The predictability of emotional supply disappears, replaced by calm detachment. The empath's indifference is not cold, it's peaceful, and peace, for an avoidant who thrives on emotional distance and control, is deeply unsettling. The empath's transformation shows the avoidant what they could have had not through words, but through presence, confidence, and serenity. The transformation of a super empath is not about revenge, it's about evolution. It's about outgrowing the patterns that once kept them trapped in cycles of overgiving and disappointment. It's about realizing that love doesn't have to be earned through suffering, and that real connection can't exist without mutual vulnerability. The empath learns to redirect the same deep care they once gave the avoidant back toward themselves. They invest in their goals, nurture their passions, and surround themselves with people who reciprocate their energy. The transformation becomes visible not through confrontation, but through vibration, the way they carry themselves, the peace that radiates from within, and the quiet confidence that says, "I no longer need you to see me for me to exist." And that's where the beauty lies. The avoidant, once comforted by the empath's devotion, is now faced with a version of them that no longer depends on their approval. The balance of emotional power has shifted completely. The empath has transformed pain into wisdom, dependency into independence, and heartbreak into freedom. This transformation, calm yet unstoppable, becomes the silent revenge not by inflicting hurt, but by becoming untouchable. The mirror effect is one of the most profound and unsettling experiences an avoidant faces when dealing with a super empath who has finally detached. When the empath withdraws their emotional energy, their silence doesn't just create space. It reflects back everything the avoidant has been avoiding within themselves. The empath becomes a mirror not through confrontation, but through absence. For so long, the empath has absorbed, soothed, and compensated for the emotional void between them. They were the light in a space filled with shadows, constantly illuminating what the avoidant refused to face. But once that light fades, the darkness becomes impossible to ignore. The avoidant begins to see the emptiness they've been projecting onto others, and that realization can be deeply unsettling. When the empath was fully engaged, the avoidant could comfortably hide behind their defenses. The empath's warmth filled the room, their reassurance softened the edges, and their patience made detachment feel tolerable. The avoidant could withdraw, knowing the empath would always reach out to pull them back. But when the empath stops reaching, the reflection changes. The avoidant no longer sees a caring face trying to understand them. They see silence, distance, and neutrality. It's in that moment they are forced to confront the truth. The connection they took for granted existed not because of mutual effort, but because of the empath's emotional endurance. Without that constant giving, the relationship's imbalance becomes painfully visible. The mirror effect exposes the emotional reality the avoidant has spent years trying to suppress. Their coldness once gave them control, but now it leaves them isolated. The empath's detachment triggers discomfort not because the avoidant suddenly becomes vulnerable, but because they're no longer being reflected through admiration, attention, or empathy. What they now see in the mirror is themselves unsoftened, unshielded, and unvalidated. The empath's absence reveals that their sense of security was built on the empath's consistent emotional effort. The energy they once thought they didn't need is suddenly the very thing they crave. For the empath, this mirror effect isn't intentional cruelty. It's a natural consequence of choosing peace. They're not trying to make the avoidant see their flaws. They're simply refusing to carry them anymore. But the impact is undeniable. The avoidant, who once felt powerful through distance, begins to feel powerless in silence. They sense the shift even if they can't articulate it. That reflection begins to challenge their emotional detachment. It's no longer comfortable, it's cold and hollow. The empathy they once dismissed now becomes the absence they can't escape. In the end, the mirror effect serves as both revelation and retribution. The avoidant is confronted not by accusations, but by reflection, an unfiltered image of their own emotional emptiness. And for the empath, it's a moment of clarity. They finally see how their light had been masking another's shadow for far too long. When they step away, the balance is restored not through punishment, but through truth. The mirror doesn't lie, and once it's held up, neither person can ever see the connection in the same way again. Healing for the super empath is not just recovery, it is reclamation. It is the process of taking back every ounce of energy, love, and care that was once poured into someone who could never truly receive it. For a long time, the empath's identity was tied to giving understanding, compassion, and reassurance, even when it was never reciprocated. They believed that love could melt the avoidance walls, that patience could unlock their heart. But healing begins the moment the empath realizes that love doesn't mean losing oneself in another person's emotional chaos. It begins when they understand that they can care deeply without sacrificing their own peace. The empath's journey of healing is not about forgetting the avoidant. It's about reclaiming the parts of themselves that got lost trying to save someone who didn't want to be saved. This healing doesn't happen overnight. It begins in the quiet moments, the mornings when the empath wakes up and no longer checks their phone for a message that never comes, the nights when they no longer replay old conversations searching for meaning. Healing feels heavy at first because it requires honesty. The empath must admit that their love alone could not fix the relationship. They must grieve the fantasy of who they thought the avoidant could become and accept who they actually were. But in that acceptance lies power. Once the empath stops hoping for change in the other person, they redirect all that emotional energy inward. They start nurturing themselves with the same tenderness they once reserved for the avoidant. They rediscover hobbies, dreams, and ambitions that had been pushed aside. They begin to feel alive again, not because someone loves them back, but because they've started loving themselves with the same depth they always offered others. The avoidant may not understand this transformation, but they will feel its impact. The empath's healing shifts the entire dynamic. The once emotionally dependent energy becomes calm, self-assured, and detached. The avoidant, used to the empath's emotional availability, begins to sense that the power they once had has dissolved. There are no more emotional outbursts, no more efforts to reconnect, no more attempts to decode mixed signals. The empath no longer seeks closure from the avoidant because they've found it within themselves. This quiet strength can be deeply unsettling for the avoidant, who relied on the empath's emotional consistency to feel secure in their detachment. Healing is also about boundaries. The empath learns that love without boundaries is self-destruction. They no longer try to earn affection or chase validation. Instead, they recognize that being loving doesn't mean tolerating emotional neglect. They learn to walk away without guilt, to say no without fear, and to choose themselves without apology. Each boundary they set becomes a declaration. My peace is not negotiable. That reclamation of power marks the true completion of healing. Ultimately, through healing, the super empath becomes whole again. They reclaim the love they gave away, the strength they forgot they had, and the voice they once silenced to keep the peace. The avoidant's coldness no longer defines them. The empathy that once felt like a burden now becomes their greatest source of strength, not something to be exploited, but something to be cherished and protected. Freedom is the final and most profound act of quiet revenge for the super empath. It's not loud or defiant, but steady, calm, and deeply self-assured. After years of emotional exhaustion, of trying to connect with someone who meets love with distance, the empath finally understands that walking away is not loss, it's liberation. They stop trying to decode the avoidance moods, stop waiting for validation, and stop giving pieces of themselves in hopes of being seen. The chains that once tied them to confusion and longing begin to fall away, one realization at a time. The empath begins to see that freedom isn't about escape. It's about release from emotional dependence, from overthinking, from trying to fix what was never theirs to fix. Freedom begins internally in the subtle moments of clarity. It's the day the empath wakes up and realizes they didn't think about the avoidant the moment they opened their eyes. It's when they stop replaying the same emotional scenarios, stop wondering what if, and start focusing on what asterisk is asterisk. They begin to rediscover joy in simple things, laughter with friends, quiet mornings, new projects, or moments of solitude that feel peaceful rather than lonely. This kind of freedom doesn't happen all at once. It builds quietly as the empath learns to redirect their energy from longing toward living. The emotional space that was once consumed by the avoidance absence is now filled with purpose, creativity, and genuine self-love. For the avoidant, this shift is both confusing and unnerving. The empath's emotional availability once made the avoidant feel in control, even safe within their own detachment. But when the empath no longer reacts, no longer reaches out, no longer tries to heal the unhealable, The avoidant is faced with a reality they never expected: irrelevance. The person who once sought their affection has found peace without it. The avoidant may try to re-engage, subtly testing the empath's boundaries, but the energy no longer connects. The empath has evolved past the point of needing to prove their worth. Their calm indifference becomes the ultimate reflection of freedom, not spiteful, but deeply rooted in peace. This freedom also represents emotional maturity. The empath has learned that love is not meant to be a battlefield of persistence and withdrawal. They've stopped romanticizing emotional unavailability and started craving stability and mutual respect. The silence that once felt like punishment now feels like serenity. They finally understand that walking away doesn't mean giving up, it means honoring their own heart. In that freedom, they no longer need closure, revenge, or recognition. Their growth speaks for itself. The beauty of the empath's freedom is that it radiates. It's seen in the way they move, speak, and live lighter, wiser, and untouchable. The avoidant's coldness no longer defines their worth or their story. The empath's life becomes proof that the best revenge isn't in showing the avoidant what they lost, but in no longer caring that they lost it. Their silence, peace, and happiness become the truest forms of victory. In the end, the silent revenge of a super empath is not about retaliation, but reclamation, reclaiming peace, power, and purpose after enduring emotional coldness. It's about realizing that the most profound response to indifference is inner transformation, that true strength lies in walking away with grace, and that silence can speak louder than any confrontation ever could. The super empath's journey is one of awakening, turning pain into wisdom, heartbreak into freedom, and silence into serenity. And that is the quiet triumph that no avoidant can ever take away. Thank you for listening, for reflecting, and for honoring the quiet power that comes from choosing yourself.